Hey there, sleuths. Welcome to the Detective's Den, your one-stop spot for unpacking mysteries, cracking cases, and diving deep into the unknown. I'm your name, and I'll be your guide on this investigative journey. Globe showing Europe, Africa. Now tell me, from which corner of the globe are you tuning in today? Drop your location in the comments below. Let's see just how far our detective network reaches. Chapter 1, An Invitation to Gorse Hill. Hercule Poirot awoke at precisely 8 o'clock to the gentle chime of his bedside clock. His immaculate morning ritual began as always, a brisk shower, a carefully folded handkerchief placed in his breast pocket, and a pair of polished shoes gleaming on the carpet. Today's breakfast was a modest affair: soft-boiled eggs, buttered toast, and a single croissant, taken with a cup of strong black coffee. Yet even as he savored each bite, his mind turned to the ivory-inked envelope that had arrived the previous evening. Sliding the envelope from its silk-lined envelope, Poirot examined the elegant script that was neither too ornate nor too plain. It read, "Dear Monsieur Poirot, it would give us the greatest pleasure if you would join us for a weekend retreat at Gorse Hill House. We have assembled a small circle of friends, artists, scholars, and the like, for a gathering of congenial conversation and country charm. We are in need of a pair of eyes keen enough to detect the smallest details. Your presence would be, in every respect, most welcome. Yours sincerely, Lord Alastair Bonwell." Poirot placed a single finger against his lips and murmured, "The little grey cells, so kindly summoned." He paused only to fetch his travelling cane and top hat before stepping into the awaiting motorcar, driven by his loyal valet, Hastings. The journey northward was through rolling fields dappled with early summer sunlight. Poirot gazed out of the window, noting the precision of hedgerows, trimmed within a quarter-inch of perfection, and the rhythmic swaying of wildflowers. Even the distant silhouette of farm labourers struck him as a series of purposeful movements, each hinting at character and habit. Hastings, seated beside him, offered a summary of the hosts. "Lord and Lady Bonwell are well regarded in Yorkshire society, sir. They entertain often, though never with the uncommon flair we have come to expect in your cases." Poirot inclined his head. "C'est bien, Hastings. Uncommon flair may distract. I prefer the subtle harmony of normality, so that any discord becomes all the more striking." Upon arrival at Gorse Hill, the first impression was of serenity. The house itself was a grand Georgian structure of honey-coloured stone, ivy curling artfully around its porches. A sweeping gravel drive led to a circular forecourt, where a single magnolia tree blossomed. As the motorcar came to a halt, Poirot stepped out and surveyed the scene. He noted, almost simultaneously, that one of the magnolia's blossom petals lay on the gravel, slightly browned at the edges, that a servant's polished heel had left an imperceptible scrape against the door frame, and that the welcome mat, though scrubbed, bore a smudge of mud from the lane. Lord Alastair Bonwell emerged onto the portico, his silk waistcoat gleaming. He was a tall, courteous gentleman whose kindly eyes brimmed with enthusiasm. "Monsieur Poirot, how delighted we are that you have accepted our invitation." He extended a hand, and Poirot, ever the gentleman, touched Lord Bonwell's cuff with reverence before accepting the handshake. "Mon ami," Poirot replied in his soft French accent, "it is I who am honoured. I anticipate a most stimulating weekend." He allowed his gaze to drift past the host to the assembled guests in the entrance hall. Victoria Bonwell, the lady of the house, received him next. She carried an air of composed elegance, a simple silk gown of pale lilac, her auburn hair swept into a neat chignon. Poirot noted the faintest hint of lavender on her cuffs and the way her smile, though warm, curiously never quite reached her eyes. Behind her, a small group formed. Edward Trevelyan, their nephew, a shy young gentleman who balanced an old leather-bound volume upon his forearm as if it were a talisman. Eloise Marchmont, a celebrated playwright whose vivacity echoed in her bright eyes and the way she gestured with delicate fingers coated in rings. Clara Pelham, an artist of some renown, with a passionate mien and a streak of cerulean blue in her otherwise raven black hair. Samuel Worthington, a banker whose immaculately tailored suit bespoke both wealth and fastidious care, yet he tapped one finger against his cufflink as though awaiting an opportune moment. Miles Hardwick, an archaeologist whose tanned skin and calloused hands marked him as a traveler. He looked at Poirot with a mixture of curiosity and excitement. As introductions proceeded, Poirot's eyes absorbed minute particulars. The sculptor's boots bore specks of soil unfamiliar to the local clay, Lady Bonwell's gloves were supple, imported, perhaps, and one of the servants hovered so near to Mr. Worthington that it suggested a familiarity beyond mere employment. Once assembled in the oak-panelled drawing-room, Poirot allowed his gaze to wander further. A marble-topped table in the centre displayed a collection of heirlooms, beneath a glass dome, a cameo brooch, an ivory letter opener inlaid with mother-of-pearl, and a modest ruby pendant. He deduced the brooch was Georgian, the letter opener a late Victorian novelty, and the pendant of far more recent manufacture, likely an anniversary gift. Lord Bonwell ushered them to settle on velvet-upholstered settees and armchairs, while Lady Bonwell poured tea into delicate bone china cups. Poirot handled his cup with precision, his little finger extended, then sipped. He closed his eyes, briefly savouring the aroma, before announcing that the blend was exceptionally fine. "It is from a new supplier in London," Lady Bonwell explained. "I thought it would add a special touch to our gathering." She released a soft laugh, though her grip on the teapot betrayed a flicker of tension. Poirot masked his surprise at the delicate hand trembling ever so slightly. "A special touch indeed," he observed. "Yet one might ask, why London and not Yorkshire green, which has so robust a character?" Before Lady Bonwell could respond, David, one of the footmen, entered with a note. Handing it to Poirot, the young man bowed and withdrew. Poirot broke the seal and read swiftly. His brow furrowed, though only momentarily. He returned the note to Hastings without comment. The note, he learned later in private, was from Scotland Yard, politely requesting that he keep them apprised of any unusual events during the weekend. The cryptic instruction amused Poirot. He had accepted the invitation precisely because he suspected that, beneath the veneer of country hospitality, something awaited discovery. The guests dispersed to acquaint themselves with the house, poetry was read aloud in the library, and Samuel Worthington escorted Mrs. Pelham to view a private gallery upstairs. Poirot remained alone in the drawing-room for a reflective moment. He set down his cup and moved to the window, parting the damask curtain. Outside, the garden stretched in manicured splendor, rose beds in full bloom and clipped hedges forming labyrinthine patterns. He observed a gardener kneeling by a rose trellis, trimming with surgical precision, but the hedge behind him bore a fresh scar, as though something heavy had been forced through. Poirot touched the window latch and discovered it to be slightly slack, not enough for an open window, but enough to permit a clever hand to manipulate it from outside without leaving fingerprints. His thoughts danced through possibilities. A solitary fingerprint on the brass latch. A footprint on the gravel below. A half-burned candle stub in the hall. Each was a fragment, a seemingly innocent detail that might coalesce into a revelation. He straightened his posture, smoothing his morning coat. "Let the game begin," he whispered to himself, stepping back as the distant peal of the dinner gong echoed through the corridors. Gorse Hill House, with its gracious façade and learned company, was poised to reveal a secret. And Hercule Poirot, with his methodical mind and elegant poise, was more than ready to uncover it. Chapter 2, The Sapphire Brooch. The following morning dawned cool and bright, the Yorkshire moorland bathed in gentle sunlight. Over breakfast in the elegant morning room, Poirot allowed his eyes to wander across the polished sideboard where a solitary glass dome awaited unveiling. Lady Victoria Bonwell, poised beside it, greeted her guests with a gracious smile. "Miss Amis," she announced, "I present to you the family's most cherished treasure, the sapphire brooch of my grandmother, Lady Henrietta Clarendon. It has passed through generations, and today, it shall at last be revealed." A small gasp passed among the guests. Poirot offered a polite nod of appreciation and rose to stand beside Lady Bonwell. The dome was lifted, and beneath it lay a brooch of exquisite workmanship, a deep blue sapphire, the size of a hazelnut, encircled by a halo of rose-cut diamonds, set in fine white gold. The gem gleamed with an almost hypnotic light. The assembled company pressed forward. Edward Trevelyan stepped close, his pale fingers hovering just above the velvet cushion. His brow furrowed in concentration, as though trying to discern some hidden inscription. Eloise Marchmont leaned in with theatrical flair, lips parted in admiration. "It's ethereal," she breathed. "As though it contains the very essence of the sky." Clara Pelham traced an imaginary circle in the air, her artist's eye appreciating the reflection and refraction. "Remarkable. The cut is flawless." Samuel Worthington adjusted his cufflink, studied the brooch impassively, then shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Miles Hardwick murmured a brief lecture on the geological origins of sapphires, much to Lady Bonwell's amusement. Poirot observed without comment. His gaze, however, lingered on finer details, a hairline scratch on the glass dome's rim, the perfect symmetry of the diamond halo, and the faintest apis polished sheen on the sapphire's surface, as if recently appraised. "Please, madam," said Poirot, turning gently to Lady Bonwell, "might I examine the brooch more closely?" She inclined her head, and Poirot stepped forward. Under the soft morning light, he inspected the mounting. His small, gloved finger traced the setting, a fine filigree of white gold that bore a maker's hallmark, an entwined HC, and a date barely visible, 1892. He tapped ever so lightly on the dome and then on the wooden table beneath, listening for any hollow echoes. The wood was solid oak, unblemished save for a small gouge at the corner, hidden by the velvet stand. As one might expect, he observed softly, a fine walnut table, but well waxed, perhaps within the last fortnight. Lady Bonwell's eyebrows lifted. "You notice everything, Monsieur Poirot?" He allowed himself a modest smile. "It is my habit to note each detail, however slight, for they may, one day, prove significant." Behind him, Mr. Worthington tapped his notebook impatiently. Lady Bonwell waved the butler forward, and tea was served. Poirot, still holding the brooch, accepted a cup, then set it down on a nearby side table, somewhat away from the main group, at an angle that allowed him to continue examining the jewel in private. Once the informal display concluded, Lady Bonwell invited the guests to explore the rest of the drawing room at leisure. Clara Pelham moved to the easel holding her latest landscape. Eloise Marchmont drifted over to a writing desk piled with theatrical drafts. Mr. Worthington inspected a set of porcelain figurines. Only Edward lingered near the brooch's resting place. Poirot approached him. "Edward, mon ami, what do you think of this heirloom?" Edward flushed. "It's beautiful beyond words. Yet, I confess, I feel some unease. Such a treasure, I wonder if it should be moved each evening to a safer vault." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "A prudent suggestion. And yet, rarely do tragedies strike in broad daylight under the host's watchful gaze. The element of surprise is what villains cherish most." Edward glanced at the dome, then at the window beyond. "The window," he murmured. Poirot followed his gaze to a tall sash window, partly ajar to allow the morning breeze. He approached and found the latch loose, worn at the edges, as though frequently handled. Outside, the rose garden's clipped hedges provided concealment. "Very good," said Poirot. "I had not noticed that earlier. We shall repair it forthwith." That afternoon, the guests gathered in the panelled drawing-room once again, summoned by Lord Bonwell to discuss plans for a garden picnic. As they departed, Poirot lingered, crouching to examine the floorboards beneath the window. He found 2 tiny specks of crimson, perhaps paint or a mineral fragment, and a single footprint in chalky dust. He preserved the print by stepping carefully aside, then pocketed a small scrap of white cloth caught beneath the sill. When the others returned, he announced that the window had been repaired and the brooch returned to its dome. He carefully carried the glass to a side table, cleaned its rim with a silk handkerchief, and replaced it. His every motion was measured, dignified. Dinner that evening was a lively affair. The long mahogany table in the dining room held candelabra that cast wavering shadows on the portraits lining the walls. Conversation turned to the brooch, to family law, to Lady Henrietta's colourful escapades in India. Poirot listened, occasionally interjecting with an apt historical note or a question that elicited revealing reactions. At dessert, Lord Bonwell toasted his guests to friendship, to fine company, and to treasures both of the heart and of heritage. His glass chimed lightly against others. Poirot's glass chimed last, the crystal singing a pure note that resonated through the room. Later that night, after the guests had retired to their rooms, Poirot stood once more in the drawing-room. He placed a single candelabra on the table beside the brooch stone, the candlelight dancing across its surface. He retrieved the scrap of cloth and the specks of crimson from his pocket. He considered them thoughtfully, then walked to the bookcase, pulling on a volume that did not exist. Instantly, part of the shelf swung open, revealing a shallow cabinet built into the wall, a relic of the house's past, perhaps intended to display valuables. The cabinet was empty, but its top shelf bore 2 impressions, one matching the shape of the brooch stone, another, a small vial. "So," murmured Poirot, "the house itself provides the stage for intrigue." He replaced the book, extinguished the candle, and walked into the corridor. A soft breeze wafted behind him, carrying the scent of lavender from Lady Bonwell's bouquet in the hall. Poirot paused at the doorway of the garden wing, listening. From far below, he heard the murmur of the river and the rustle of leaves. Yet in the stillness, he fancied he detected another sound, a faint clink, like metal on glass. Back in his suite, he removed his gloves and sat at the dressing table. He arranged the brooch stone, lace-handed and imperceptibly scratched, on a tray. He spread the scrap of cloth and the crimson specks on a sheet of blotting paper. He poured himself a glass of sherry and lit an icon lamp, its glow mellow and warm. "Tomorrow," he said, raising his glass to the empty room, "Miss Amis, we will continue. For it seems that the sapphire brooch is not merely an ornament, but the keystone of a mystery waiting to be unearthed." He sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers, his expression serene yet intense. Outside, the moon rose over Gorse Hill House, its pale light smoothing the mansion's contours. And within those walls, a secret stirred, eager to reveal itself to the detective with the imperious moustache and the meticulous mind. Thus ended the 2nd chapter of The Weekend at Gorse Hill, a chapter not merely of beauty and admiration, but of subtle clues laid like stepping stones across a hidden stream, each awaiting the careful tread of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells. Chapter 3, A Vanished Heirloom. The late afternoon sunlight had faded to a mellow glow when the household assembled in the drawing-room for pre-dinner wine. A hush settled as Lady Victoria Bonwell beckoned the maid to retrieve the sapphire brooch. The glass dome stood on its velvet cushion as before, yet when the dome was lifted, the brooch was gone. A startled gasp rippled through the room. Lord Bonwell's fork clattered against his plate, Lady Bonwell's composure wavered, her eyes glossing with shock. Edward Trevelyan launched to his feet, as though to chase an invisible thief. Samuel Worthington rose with studied calm, his face an impassive mask, but Poirot noted how his shoulders tensed. Clara Pelham stood rooted to the spot, her sketchbook slipping from nervous fingers. Even Miles Hardwick, who had been waxing lyrical about local geology, fell silent, his gaze darting as though seeking an escape. Poirot, seated quietly in his armchair at the far end of the room, allowed the moment to unfold. He raised a gloved hand, just enough to catch the eye of the butler, who prudently closed the door behind him. Miss Amis, je vous en prie, Poirot's voice rang with calm authority. Let us not alarm ourselves further. The brooch is merely displaced, not vanished by magic. He inclined his head to Lord Bonwell. Pray, allow me a few minutes to investigate. Will you kindly request that no one leave the room until I have spoken with each of you? The hosts exchanged glances, then nodded. The company settled. Lady Bonwell sank onto a settee, Edward flanked her anxiously, his hand poised to defend. Worthington leaned against the mantel, one cufflink glinting. Pelham pressed her lips together, fanning invisible airs, and Hardwick straightened his collar, as though preparing for battle. Poirot rose and walked to the mahogany sideboard where he had first examined the dome. He bent to inspect the polished wood, his eyes narrow in concentration. He discovered a faint crescent of glass where the dome's edge had scraped the surface, a clean curve that matched the brooch's own silhouette. On the back leg of the table, a smudge of velvet nap terrified him, a fragment of the mount's base cloth, dislodged when lifted too swiftly. He pocketed it in his waistcoat. Now, if you will permit, I should like to speak with each of you in turn, he announced. He gestured to Edward Trevelyan, who rose with pallid urgency. Poirot guided him into the adjoining library, where the light was gentler and the scents of leather and old parchment whispered comfort. Edward, Poirot began, when did you last see the brooch? Edward swallowed. Just after luncheon, monsieur. I passed through this room upon returning from the terrace. The brooch lay beneath the dome as always. I stopped to admire it, but only for a moment. His fingers trembled. I went upstairs to my uncle's study to fetch a book on heraldry. By the time I returned, it was gone. Poirot nodded. And did you encounter anyone else in the corridor? Edward hesitated. I thought I saw Clara, her artist's smock billowing as she carried a portfolio toward the east wing. But I cannot say for certain it was she. Missy, mon ami. Poirot gestured forward. Clara Pelham, please. In the drawing room, Clara rose with reluctance. Poirot led her to the window seat, where afternoon light fell softly upon her. She smoothed her skirts. Madam, did you pass this room today? Clara's dark eyes flickered. I did. I sought a clearer view of the garden for inspiration. I passed the window and saw no one, but I confess, I did glance at the brooch, as any artist would. Indeed. Yet the dome's rim bears a faint scratch, Poirot said, indicating with a fingertip the same curve he had noted. One might crouch to lift it quickly. Clara's face paled. I would never dream of touching it without permission. Poirot inclined his head. Of course. But did you exit by the garden door, or return to the central hall? I returned through the corridor. I did not enter this room again. Very well. Next came Samuel Worthington. Poirot intercepted him as he lingered by the portrait of Lady Henrietta. The banker's practiced manner gave little away. Monsieur Worthington, a simple question, have you handled the brooch today? Worthington's lips curved into a courteous smile. I have admired it from a distance, monsieur. Poirot studied his cuffs. Your cufflink, silver, engraved with your family crest. I see no traces of velvet, yet the table leg concealed a fragment. If one had worn gloves, the trace would be minimal. Worthington stiffened. My gloves remain firmly on my person, monsieur. Then I must seek elsewhere, Poirot murmured, stepping back. Eloise Marchmorne had wisely withdrawn to the hearth, where she sat composing herself. Poirot joined her with quiet steps. Miss Marchmorne, you write of intrigue for the stage. Might you have embellished reality with action today? Eloise's laugh was brittle. Monsieur, I promise you I treasure authentic detail. Yet I did not handle the brooch. Nevertheless, your artistic temperament might have led you to linger longer by the display. She traced the rim of a teacup. I was here, yes, and I found it magnificent. But I left abruptly when I heard Lord Bonwell's voice calling from the terrace. Which brings us to Mr. Hardwick. The archaeologist had retreated to examine a small statuette. Poirot cornered him there. Mr. Hardwick, you study ancient relics, and this brooch is a relic, though newer. Did you examine it this morning? Hardwick adjusted his glasses. I did, with Lady Bonwell's permission. I was enthralled by its cut and provenance. Yet you return no later visits. No, monsieur. Poirot paused, his gaze traversing the assembled witnesses outside the library. All accounts differ slightly. Each of you passed this room today, each of you admired the brooch. But there is one crucial fact, the brooch was removed not by force, but by delicate handling. My little grey cells tell me the thief is precise. He returned to the drawing room and faced the company. Miss Amis, I propose we search the grounds immediately, before dusk. The brooch may have been concealed in the garden, awaiting retrieval. Lord Bonwell rang for the butler, issuing instructions to assemble torches and lanterns. Outside, the guests fanned out under Poirot's direction. Edward and Clara scoured the rose garden, Worthington and Hardwick examined the kitchen yard, Eloise and Lady Bonwell inspected the shrubbery near the terrace. Poirot himself moved silently, pausing to inspect footprints in gravel, to note a disturbed patch of earth by the fountain, to discover a length of thin wire snagged on a rose bush. Yet as one search party reassembled, Poirot commanded a halt. He held up the fragment of velvet. The brooch was lifted from its dome without gloves. One would have to trust that no fibers remained on one's hands. Only someone with confidence in their dexterity would attempt so. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Lady Bonwell gripped her husband's arm, Edward lowered his gaze, Clara's knuckles whitened around her sketchbook, Worthington cleared his throat, Hardwick clenched his jaw, Eloise's breath caught in her throat. Poirot pocketed the velvet. In the morning, I shall review these clues. For now, let us seek repose. The brooch, I assure you, will reappear. They departed quietly, the torches casting wavering shadows on the house's façade. Poirot lingered by the open window for a moment, inhaling the night air scented by honeysuckle and damp grass. He observed the broken wires draped over the rose stems, a makeshift hook, perhaps, to lift the dome into the passage. He touched the dome's base on the sideboard. The wood was smooth, unblemished except for that solitary gouge at the corner. Returning indoors, he found his valet, Hastings, awaiting him with waters and towels. Poirot handed over the fragment of crimson velvet. This, Hastings, may prove instrumental. Hastings bowed and took his leave. Poirot turned to the mirror, smoothing his moustache. Demain, on Amy. Tomorrow, the little grey cells will yield the culprit. He blew out the lamp, and Gorse Hill House settled into midnight stillness, its secrets tucked within oak beams and panelled walls. Yet Poirot, with his unfaltering poise and methodical mind, would soon unravel the mystery of the vanished heirloom. Chapter 4: Poison in the Parlor. The hush of the drawing-room after dinner was absolute, broken only by the soft glow of the shaded lamp and the gentle tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Lady Victoria Bonwell, seeking to restore lighter spirits after the unsettling theft of the sapphire brooch, poured a final round of tea for her guests. The air was warm from the fire, and shadows danced along the wood-paneled walls, creating an atmosphere both intimate and charged with unspoken tension. Clara Pelham sat nearest the hearth, her artistic temperament soothed by its flickering warmth. Samuel Worthington reclined in the wing-back chair opposite, his polished shoes tucked neatly beneath him. Eloise Marchmorn, ever the dramatist, floated between chairs, offering anecdotes of her latest play. Miles Hudwick and Edward Trevelyan stood near the French windows, conversing in low tones about antiquities. Poirot himself leaned casually against a side table, his moustachios curled ever so slightly at the corners, observing each guest with that imperturbable calm which both reassured and unnerved. Lady Bonwell lifted a silver teapot, its surface gleaming in the lamplight. "Shall we have yet another cup to ease our minds?" she asked, with a gracious smile that did little to conceal her own anxiety. "Mais oui," Poirot replied, bowing slightly. "A small libation of tranquility before we retire." As the butler circulated with the delicate bone china teacups, Clara accepted one with a thankful sigh. She drew the cup to her lips and sipped. Then, suddenly, her head snapped back, she gasped, her hand clattering the cup to the floor. Tea splashed across the Persian rug, and Clara collapsed backward into her chair, her face ashen. "Clara!" Eloise cried, rushing forward. Samuel bounded up. Poirot was at her side in an instant, lifting a hand to the girl's wrist to take her pulse. Lady Bonwell sprang up, her eyes wide with horror. "Something is very wrong," Poirot announced quietly, his voice steady even as he pressed 2 fingers to Clara's neck. Her pulse was rapid and irregular. "She tastes of bitterness. Something not of tea." Edward frowned. "Poison," he whispered. Poirot nodded grimly. "Perhaps." Quickly, someone fetch brandy, and remove this cup. A footman dashed out, returning with brandy and smelling salts. As Eloise fanned Clara's face, Poirot examined the discarded teacup and saucer. He raised them to the lamplight, inspecting the rims and interior. The cup's glaze was intact, yet a faint oily residue clung to the inside. He sniffed cautiously, there was an acrid tang beneath the fragrant tea. "Note," he said softly to Lady Bonwell, "that the sugar basin remains untouched. No granules of sugar on this saucer." He tapped the saucer's rim. If one wished to disguise a poison, one might omit sugar to avoid concealing particles that could incriminate. Samuel, anxious to help, began to search the side table. "Here, in the tea caddy." He lifted the silver lid to reveal a polished inner container. Poirot's keen eyes spotted the subtle gap. "See, there is a second lid, unscrewed." Before Samuel could replace it, Poirot took the caddy and twisted the lid fully off. Inside lay the leaves of Lady Bonwell's chosen blend, now perfumed faintly with something metallic. He sniffed them thoughtfully. "Ingenious," he murmured. "The poison must have been introduced here, long before the tea was served. One stirs the mixture, and by evening, the taste is well masked. Then the intended victim drinks." Clara, her color returning, opened her eyes. "Monsieur, what happened?" she croaked. Poirot smiled reassuringly. "Ah, madam, you are fortunate. A quick replacement of your cup, and you shall be restored in no time." He signaled Eloise, who replaced Clara's cup with a fresh one, hastily brewed without sugar, and administered mild brandy. Within moments, Clara was breathing more easily, her eyes brighter though still glassy with shock. Lady Bonwell sank into her chair, hands clasped. "But why, Clara?" I did not hear her express any interest in the brooch beyond admiration. Edward knelt beside his cousin. "Clara, did anyone offer you tea from another pot? Did you see any stranger here?" Clara shook her head. "No one else was in the room. I poured from this very caddy. It was here when I arrived." "Precisely," Poirot said, glancing at the caddy and then at the elegant server who hovered in the doorway. "I think it prudent to question our staff, and perhaps to secure the tea caddy until we discern more." He rose and moved towards the little side alcove where the caddy had stood. Inspecting the surrounding surfaces, he found a single grain of white powder on the table's edge, too large to be sugar, too white to be tea sediment. He scooped it up on his fingertip and transferred it to a small glass vial he carried. "Mrs. Pelham," he called gently, "do you recall when this caddy was filled?" Clara's brow furrowed. "Just after dinner, when the butler brought fresh leaves from the kitchen." Poirot nodded. "Then the poison was inserted in the kitchen, or by a hand familiar with its mechanisms. We must speak with the cook and kitchen maid." Yet even as he spoke, his mind raced through possibilities. The poison, what might it be? The bitterness suggested aconite or perhaps strychnine. Both, if administered quickly, could render one delirious or collapse suddenly. A telegram to Scotland Yard for immediate analysis seemed wise. "Edward," Poirot said, turning to the young man, "would you be so kind as to send a dispatch to London? Ask for an urgent examination of this sample." He handed him the vial. "Inform them that time is of the essence." Edward bowed and hurried away. Poirot returned to Clara, now seated more comfortably. "How do you feel, madam?" "Dizzy, but stronger," she replied. "Thank you, monsieur." He smiled. "Rest now. We shall ensure your safety." He laid a gloved hand gently on her shoulder before he walked to join Lady Bonwell and Mr. Worthington. The banker watched him with narrowed eyes. "This has escalated quickly, monsieur. A theft, then an attempt on a guest's life." Poirot nodded. "Indeed. It appears that our thief, whatever motive, wishes to remove obstacles. The brooch was merely the first act, the second, to silence anyone who might interfere." Samuel's jaw tightened. "But the poison was delivered so subtly, with no trace of foul play until now." "Such is the art of the assassin," Poirot replied calmly. "Yet even the most careful plan has its flaws. Here, the secondary lid on the caddy, unscrewed but never secured. A clumsy oversight in an otherwise precise crime." Lady Bonwell rose. "We must inform the police at once." Poirot shook his head. "Not yet. Let us discover more before alarming the entire household. In the meantime, I suggest that no one enter the kitchen without accompaniment, and that the caddy remain under guard." They agreed. Poirot then excused himself to visit the kitchen. There he found Mrs. Hudson, the housekeeper, and a nervous kitchen maid, Mary. After introductions and assurances that Clara was recovering, Poirot gently questioned them about the evening's preparations. "The cook filled the caddy myself," Mary stammered. "She left it on the larder shelf, then. I fetched it when asked." "And you did not notice the lid loose?" Poirot asked. Mary shook her head. "No, sir. I thought the lid had been tightened. The cook, well, she's ill in bed with a fever." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "How convenient. Perhaps I shall inspect the caddy again later." He pocketed another grain of the white powder Mary admitted she swept from the shelf earlier, where a fine residue had settled. Returning to the drawing room, Poirot found Edward pacing, cradling the telegram form. "They'll send someone today," Edward said. "By tomorrow morning we shall know what killed Clara." "Excellent," Poirot replied. "In the meantime, let us continue as though nothing has happened. Appear calm, though watchful. I shall this night examine the caddy more thoroughly, and perhaps inspect the tea leaves under a lens." He paused, glancing at the parlour clock. "Now, Miss Amis, let us part for rest. And should anyone feel uneasy, remember that justice, with patience and observation, will prevail." The guests dispersed, leaving Poirot alone before the hearth. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the empty teacup Clara had used and the caddy still under guard. Quietly, he retrieved his magnifying glass, prepared his notes, and in the gentle lamplight began to unravel the next thread of the mystery, sure that each minute detail, no matter how small, would soon guide him to the truth behind the poisoning at Gorse Hill. Chapter 5: The Secret Passage. The following morning, a mist clung to the gardens of Gorse Hill, lending the hedgerows a silvered, mysterious aspect. After breakfast, Hercule Poirot invited Edward Trevelyan to accompany him on a brief exploration of the East Wing, an area of the house Edward admitted he seldom visited. The nephew, eager to assist, guided Poirot down a narrow corridor lined with ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow their footsteps. "Here, monsieur," Edward said, pausing before a panel of dark oak. "This is where the family archives are kept. I come rarely, but when I do, I find comfort among these volumes." He pushed aside a pair of heavy drapes to reveal a tall bookcase whose lower shelves contained leather-bound registers and meticulously kept scrapbooks. Poirot ran a gloved finger along the fine grain of the wood, his small moustaches twitching. Edward, observe the panel beneath this shelf. He tapped lightly, and the faint hollow note that resulted confirmed his suspicion. There is a seam, carefully concealed. "May I?" With Edward's permission, Poirot applied gentle pressure, and a narrow door swung inward to reveal a shadow passageway. Inside, the air was cool and faintly musty, redolent of untold secrets. A single gas lamp, long unlit, cast a dim glow on stone walls. The corridor sloped downward, leading to a low arched ceiling that suggested this was no ordinary servant's way, but rather a clandestine route between the East Wing and the drawing room's vicinity. "Remarkable," Poirot murmured. "A private thoroughfare, known only to the family, I should think." Edward swallowed. "I had no idea it existed. There must be a switch somewhere, perhaps in my uncle's study." He pressed lightly on a second panel. Nothing happened. Poirot crouched to inspect the hinges of the door they had entered through. They were newer than the surrounding metalwork, as though replaced in recent months. They advanced cautiously, stepping on a threadbare strip of carpet that muffled their footfalls. Partway along, Poirot paused and pointed. On the flagstone floor lay a single white glove. It was neatly stitched and bore an embroidered M in midnight blue thread on its cuff. "Monsieur Hardwicke's initial," Poirot observed, slipping the glove into a small evidence bag he carried. "Does Mr. Hardwicke frequent this corridor, Edward?" Edward shook his head, astonished. "Not to my knowledge. He has been in the library most mornings." He looked pensive. "He is thorough, yes, but not secretive." Poirot stood, illuminating the path by touch, a narrow groove beside the wall, where someone might cling in the darkness. "We must continue." They reached the far end, where a hidden latch opened onto the back of the drawing room's paneling. The dome that once housed the sapphire brooch stood nearby on a side table, but now empty once again, its velvet cushion disturbed. Poirot's keen gaze noted the precise alignment of the panel and the faint scratch on its underside. "See here," Poirot said, retrieving a small lens from his waistcoat. He examined the scratched wood. This line corresponds exactly with the dome's rim. Whoever lifted the glass used this passage to avoid observation. He replaced the dome and tested the latch. It clicked smoothly, betraying frequent use. As they retraced their steps, Poirot paused to examine the torch bracket on the wall. He found a scrap of blue-grey paint lodged in a chip beside it, an odd hue for interior walls, but one that matched the paint smear discovered earlier on Samuel Worthington's cuff. Poirot's eyes glinted. A clue linking the passage to the banker's attire. Yet we know he vehemently denied using gloves. Curious. Emerging back into the archive, Edward closed the secret door behind them and replaced the drapes. "Monsieur Poirot, this is astonishing, yet frightening," he murmured. "What more awaits us in these hidden chambers?" Poirot pocketed the scrap of paint and regarded Edward with gentle seriousness. "My friend, the secret passage confirms that the thief sought privacy. But the glove and paint suggest collaboration, or at least an attempt to mislead." He pursed his lips. "We must consider all possibilities, that Mr. Hardwick lent the glove, or that it was planted to frame him. Likewise, the paint smear could be an intentional red herring, implicating Mr. Worthington." Edward's face darkened. "But if so, who then truly wields these threads? Someone with access to personal items belonging to each guest, a glove, a paintbrush, even knowledge of poison in the tea caddy." He swallowed. "And someone who understands the layout of the house intimately." Poirot nodded. "Exactly. This secret corridor is central. Whoever controls it can come and go unseen, and has studied the house's history. It may be someone of the household, or a guest with a penchant for research." He set his jaw. "Tomorrow, I shall examine Mr. Hardwick's rooms for traces of this corridor's dust or residue." They returned to the morning room, where Lady Bonwell awaited them anxiously. She clasped Edward's arm upon seeing the glove Poirot revealed. "Miles's glove," she exclaimed. "He wore one this afternoon while sketching the estate grounds. How does Mr. Hardwick explain its presence here?" Poirot asked, keeping his tone even. Edward looked embarrassed. "He must have removed it earlier this morning. He said he preferred being unencumbered when reading." He glanced at Poirot. "I spoke with him only minutes ago in the library." Poirot inclined his head. "Then the glove was deposited after Mr. Hardwick left this corridor. That would require two people, one to steal the brooch and another to misplace or plant evidence." He paused, weighing the implications. "The plot thickens, n'est-ce pas, Lord Bonwell?" The host, alarmed, rubbed his brow. "This is more tangled than I imagined. First the theft, then the poisoning, now secret passages and planted clues. I fear for the safety of my family and guests." Poirot offered a reassuring smile. "Fear not, my lord. Every contrivance, every misdirection, is a step toward the truth. The little grey cells never are when guided by methodical observation." He produced the glove, placing it in Lady Bonwell's hand. "Keep this safe. And let no one enter the east wing unsupervised." She complied, and Poirot turned his attention back to Edward. "You will accompany me to Mr. Hardwick's suite after lunch. We shall see whether the dust of this corridor tarnishes his carpet, or if other telltale residues surface." Edward nodded, his resolve firming. "Yes, monsieur. Whatever the cost, we must uncover the truth." As Poirot left the room, he paused at the threshold, surveying the assembled party. Each face bore a mixture of curiosity and unease. The secret passage had opened a new chapter in his investigation, one that would demand both psychological insight and meticulous scrutiny. He smoothed his coat, flicked the glove gently, and whispered to himself, Onward, Miss Amos. The masterstroke awaits discovery in the most concealed recesses of Gorse Hill. And with that, Hercule Poirot strode into the corridor once more, hopeful that the next clue lay just beyond his brilliant little grey cells. Chapter 6, Minds Under Examination. The hush of mid-morning settled over Gorse Hill House as sunlight filtered through tall mullioned windows, casting latticed patterns on the Persian rugs. After breakfast, Poirot summoned the entire household to the library, a spacious room lined with oak bookshelves, its heavy curtains drawn back to reveal the manicured tennis lawn beyond. He had devised an exercise he called the examination of minds, a subtle parlor game designed to prompt each guest to speak, while he watched for the slightest flicker of expression or hesitation. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle before the fireplace, and each guest took a seat as Poirot stood in their midst, his posture perfectly erect, hands clasped behind his back. He wore a crisp morning suit, his waistcoat's gold chain catching the light as he turned to address them. "Miss Amos," he began, in his gentle French accent, "we have encountered many curious events, the theft of the sapphire brooch, the attempt upon Madame Pelham's life, and the discovery of a secret passage. Now, let us probe the inner workings of our own minds. I shall ask each of you a simple question, to which I request an honest answer. There will be no interruption. Are we agreed?" A murmur of assent rippled through the group. Lady Bonwell nodded, her hands folded demurely in her lap. Edward sat forward, knuckles white against his book. Clara's eyes flicked nervously around the room. Samuel Worthington leaned back, his expression inscrutable. Eloise perched on her chair's edge as though eager for the spotlight, and Miles Hardwick sat with a courteous smile, fingers steepled. "Very well," said Poirot. "We begin with Lady Victoria." He inclined his head. "Madam, what is the greatest fear that visits you in the stillness of night?" Lady Bonwell considered. Her eyes drifted to the portrait of her grandmother, Lady Henrietta Clarendon, whose austere gaze seemed to appraise her. At last Victoria spoke softly, but with surprising resolve, "that I have failed to protect what is most precious, my family's legacy, and those I hold dear." Her voice quavered briefly, then steadied. Poirot's eyes narrowed, though his expression remained calm. He moved on to Edward. "Monsieur Trevelyan, tell us, what is the one question you would most wish solved, if you could ask only one?" Edward's face flushed. He hesitated, then replied, "I would ask why the brooch was stolen. Not for its value, but because I fear it signifies something unseen, an intention I cannot yet fathom." His gaze met Poirot's, unwavering for a moment, before flickering to Clara at his side. Clara Pelham was next. "Madame Pelham, you have witnessed great beauty and also great darkness. Tell us, what emotion stirs within you now, as you gaze upon your fellow guests?" Clara's lips parted, as though to protest the question's intrusion, but she sighed and admitted, "I feel suspicion, and sorrow. Suspicion, because I can think of no gentler word for how I view those who might harm another. And sorrow, for the trust that has been broken here." Her fingers unconsciously brushed a smear of blue from her sleeve where paint remained. Poirot's gaze lingered upon that smudge, then turned to Samuel Worthington. "Monsieur Worthington, you handle great sums of money and understand risk. Tell us, what is your greatest risk in remaining at Gorse Hill?" Worthington's posture stiffened. His eyes darted to the fireplace before he answered, "My greatest risk, monsieur, is embarrassment, if it should emerge that I am not as prudent as I appear, that I have, let us say, overextended myself financially." He cleared his throat. "But I assure you, I am solvent and eager to assist in any inquiry." Eloise Marchmorn perched forward next, her eyes alight. "Miss Marchmorn, you create plots that enthrall audiences. If your life were a play, which character would you be, and why?" Eloise's laugh rang out, though it held a tinge of nervous energy. Ah, Monsieur Poirot, I would be both the ingénue and the femme fatale, torn between innocence and seduction, light and shadow. Because I believe that each of us has within the capacity for both. She fluttered her eyelashes at him, but her fingers drummed anxiously on her knee. Finally, Miles Hardwick. Poirot offered him a book, a thin volume on medieval seals, before posing his question, Monsieur, you unearth treasures from long-buried tombs. Tell us, what secret would you most like to discover, here at Gorse Hill? Miles adjusted his glasses, then replied evenly, I would unearth the truth of human nature, that which drives us to protect, to harm, to hide. No artifact interests me more than the motives we conceal. He closed the book, tapping its cover with deliberate calm. Poirot surveyed them in silence, as though absorbing the patterns of voice and posture. Then he turned to face them. Miss Amis, thank you for your candor. You have revealed much about yourselves, your fears, your ambitions, your dualities. Yet it is not merely what you have said, but how you have said it that matters. He straightened, tapping one finger to his temple. Observe. He pointed first at Lady Bonwell. You spoke of protection and legacy. Indeed, you have guarded your family's treasures with care, but also, perhaps, with some guilt that you entrusted the brooch to a delicate glass dome rather than to a vault. Is that not so? Victoria drew a small breath. I wished our guests to appreciate its beauty. I thought no harm could come. Very well. And Monsieur Trevelyan, Poirot continued, turning to Edward. You asked why it was stolen, fearing an unknown intention. Your anxiety is not only for the brooch, but for your place in this family. You have much at stake, reputation, inheritance, esteem. Edward bowed his head, but did not deny the assessment. Madame Pelham, Poirot said, nodding to Clara. You feel suspicion and sorrow. Indeed, your artistic soul seeks to capture truth in strokes of color, but you resent having to capture deception in human hearts. You regret that art has given you eyes that see too clearly. Clara's gaze fell, a tear glimmering. She brushed it away. Yes, she whispered. Samuel Worthington's tie quivered as he listened. Monsieur Worthington, Poirot addressed him, your risk is embarrassment, you say, if your finances are found wanting. Yet your impulsive denial of gloves and your frantic insistence on propriety suggest deeper anxieties, perhaps that you fear accusation more than discovery. Worthington's face hardened, but he said nothing. Eloise Marchmorn leaned forward, as though eager for praise. Miss Marchmorn, you would play both ingénue and femme fatale. A creative paradox. Yet your theatrical heart seeks attention. You wish to be center stage, and the disappearance of the brooch, and the poison, provide you with the drama you crave. Eloise's color rose. I never sought harm, monsieur. Only inspiration. Indeed, Poirot said softly. But one must be cautious what one inspires. He allowed a silent moment to pass before moving on to Miles Hardwick. Monsieur Hardwick, you seek the truth of human nature above all. Yet you have concealed knowledge of this secret passage until now. Why hide that which you found? Miles swallowed. I feared it would be dismissed as fanciful, that only I understand its significance. He paused. And I admit I visited it yesterday, curious to test whether it might serve more than academic interest. Poirot inclined his head. A confession of curiosity, and perhaps complicit intent. Curiosity that led you to examine the dome's misalignment. He folded his arms. Miss Amis, each of you bears a motive, or at least the seed of one. Each of you has concealed something, doubts, secrets, half-spoken fears. Yet only one among you aimed higher than theft, one who attempted to silence Madame Pelham. He turned to the assembled company, letting his eyes rest on each face in turn. Tonight, I shall convene a further gathering, one in which I will test your truths against a single revelation. Until then, continue your usual pursuits. But remember, I am no mere spectator. I observe all. The little grey cells sift through each utterance, each tremor of the bosom, until the real motive emerges. With that, Poirot swept from the room, leaving his guests to absorb the weight of his words. A silence fell, broken only by the ticking clock and the distant call of a gardener tending the estate. One by one, they rose and dispersed, some to the drawing-room, others to practice tennis, and one or two to brooding solitude. Clara lingered, tracing the grain of a bookshelf with trembling fingers. Edward stood near the window, staring at the rose garden. Eloise flitted to the hearth, where the embers of last night's fire still glowed. Samuel retreated to the dining room, as though to examine silverware. Miles, however, returned to the east wing, to peer once more at the seam of that secret panel. And at the center of it all, Hercule Poirot sat alone in the library, his steepled fingers pressed to his moustache, his eyes alight with the certainty that each mind under examination would soon betray the kernel of truth, and that when that moment arrived, the secret of Gorse Hill would be laid bare. Chapter 7, Tensions Tighten. The dawn of the final day at Gorse Hill broke under a slate-grey sky, as if the very heavens had paused to consider the unfolding drama within those venerable walls. After breakfast, the guests dispersed to their customary diversions, but an undercurrent of unease pulsed through each corridor. Poirot, his demeanour as impeccable as ever, warranted an attentive audience. He summoned Lord and Lady Bonwell, Edward Trevelyan, and the remaining guests to the morning room, where the windows looked out upon the sodden lawns. Miss Amis, Poirot began evenly, we have in recent days witnessed theft, attempted poisoning, and the revelation of a secret passage. The time approaches when all shall be laid bare, but before my final assembly this evening, there are a few matters I wish to pursue. He turned first to Lady Bonwell. Victoria, I would ask you to show me once more the glass dome in which the brooch formerly rested. Victoria led the party through the drawing-room, where the empty dome stood on its mahogany plinth. Poirot examined the wood and the glass with fresh eyes. I note, he said, that the gouge on the corner has widened slightly, evidence that the dome has been handled again since last it stood in your memory. He tapped the glass. And this pane, though smooth, carries two faint hairlines, perhaps due to careless placement upon a dressing gown. Might we inspect your boudoir, madam? Victoria hesitated for a heartbeat, then agreed. In her bedchamber, Poirot scrutinized the dressing table and its surroundings. A silk gown, identical to one Lady Bonwell wore on the first evening, lay draped over a chair, its hem lightly scuffed. Worthington's faint floral scent lingered in the air, though Victoria had worn it before. Poirot pocketed a single hair that clung to the fabric. Returning to the morning room, he addressed Samuel Worthington. Mr. Worthington, you mentioned to me your admiration for this house. Yet yesterday I observed muddy tracks leading to the cellar door, tracks unlike those of gardeners. Care to explain when you last visited the cellars? Worthington's face paled. I went to inspect the wine myself, monsieur. The butler informed me that a broken bottle required removal. He swallowed. I found nothing amiss. Poirot inclined his head. Except a small vial or two, discarded behind a stack of empty cases. I trust you removed those safely? Worthington cleared his throat. I disposed of them, yes. I thought them part of Lady Bonwell's medicinal supplies. Poirot's small moustache quivered with amusement. Medicinal supplies indeed, aconite? Strychnine? We shall see what our analysis reveals. But tell me, did you wear gloves in the cellar? Worthington glanced at his immaculate hands. No, monsieur. I felt them unnecessary. Curious, Poirot murmured. He made no further remark, merely noted the banker's discomfort. Turning to Miles Hardwick, Poirot said, Mr. Hardwick, you discovered the secret passage and later denied frequenting it. Yet this morning, I found a dark smudge on its outer latch, a pigment matching the chartreuse of your expedition shirt. He held up a small swatch for comparison. Would you care to explain? Miles's chest rose and fell. I leaned upon it when I unlatched the panel. The fabric scraped against the metal. He paused. I meant no deception, monsieur. Poirot nodded, yet his eyes betrayed skepticism. Very well. And Miss Marchmorn, have you anything to say for yourself? Eloise, who had remained silent, raised a single brow. Poirot pressed a button on a small bell. The butler entered and delivered a slim portfolio to the detective. Inside lay several pages of Eloise's latest play, entitled The Midnight Heist. The plot featured a daring theft of a family jewel, a secret tunnel, and a dramatic poisoning, all occurring in a country house remarkably like Gorse Hill. Poirot placed the manuscript upon the table. I find it illuminating, Miss Marchmorn. You have written, it appears, a narrative almost identical to the events here. Was this mere coincidence, or did you draw inspiration from your surroundings? Eloise's cheeks flushed. Inspiration, yes. A writer observes her setting and weaves it into fiction. It is only art. He folded the pages. Art that mirrors life too closely might be called foreknowledge. But we shall see. At this moment, Edward Trevelyan interjected, voice steady despite inner turmoil. Monsieur Poirot, if I may I ask when you expect the analysis of the tea caddy powder and the vial residue? Poirot smiled kindly. This very afternoon, I trust. Meanwhile, let us continue our inquiries. He motioned them to chairs, and as they sat, he produced the half-crushed matchbox he had found earlier beneath the rose garden bench. The tiny box bore a theatre's insignia, starlit marquee bulbs encircling the words, Grand Lyric, London. What do we infer? Poirot asked. A theatrical connection, perhaps our dramatist, Miss Marchmorn, visited the garden late last night to test her secret passage. He let the question hang, and Eloise's lip trembled. The theatre, she began, but Edward cut in. I found that matchbox after midnight. I thought someone had been smoking, a breach of the house rules. His voice caught. But no one owns a theatre's matches here. Poirot turned the box between his fingers. So we must find the common thread, matches, manuscript, secret passage, poison, and vanished brooch. Each clue points to one mastermind, or to a partnership. He paused, eyes sweeping the group. Tell me, who might possess both scientific knowledge and theatrical flair? Silence followed, broken only by a distant clock striking 11. Lady Bonwell rose. I must retire. These questions, they trouble me. She left with a weary grace. As the guests thinned, Poirot invited Edward aside. Edward, observe the garden paths. Last night was wet, yet the path to the secret passage entrance is almost dry, suggesting someone carried a lantern carefully to avoid damp. Who among the house staff has such lanterns? The gardener perhaps, but none have motive. Edward frowned. Only one among us carries a lantern regularly, the archaeologist, Mr. Hardwick, when he visits the East Wing to fetch notes. Poirot inclined his head. Indeed. Yet Mr. Hardwick admits his visits, and we find no poison vials in his quarters. Which brings us back to Miss Marchmont's play. He tapped the matchbox. Matches to light a lamp, a writer's knowledge, and a dramatic narrative acted in reality. Eloise, I fear, wrote her masterpiece in living form. He sighed. But I must be certain. He returned to the morning room, where the others now lingered awkwardly. Miss Amis, I shall require your assistance tonight. Before dinner, I ask that each of you bring to me one personal item, a glove, a hairpin, a cufflink, anything you would wish to see examined. Place them upon this table. He gestured to a small centerpiece. They eyed one another but filed out to comply. Poirot watched each departure with keen interest. Worthington straightened his cuffs, as though for display. Clara fingered her paintbrush case hesitantly. Miles tucked the swatch of chartreuse into his pocket. Eloise paused, hand at her heart. Edward collected an old signet ring from his waistcoat. Alone at last, Poirot arranged the assembled items: Victoria's silk gown fragment, Worthington's cufflink, Clara's paintbrush cap, Miles's embroidered swatch, Eloise's script pages, Edward's ring. He studied them as one might regard pieces on a chessboard, each with potential to capture a king, or to reveal a pawn. The butler entered and announced lunch. Poirot dismissed him with a nod. Lunch can wait a moment, he murmured, for the game draws near its climax. He smoothed the edges of the manuscript pages, then closed his eyes, allowing his little grey cells to sift the evidence, the theatre matches and script, the secret corridor and glove, the paint smear and chartreuse, the chamber's soot and lantern's carriage, the poison and its disguise. A faint knock sounded at the door. Edward entered quietly, his face solemn. The analysis has arrived, monsieur. The powder from the tea caddy is aconite, and the residue from the vial is the same. The laboratory also notes traces of belladonna, an additive to heighten the effect. Poirot's eyes gleamed. A dual-action poison, one to collapse and one to confuse. Ingenious, yet dangerous. Only someone with some knowledge of chemistry and theatre of the mind would attempt such a feat. He rose, placing a hand on Edward's shoulder. Prepare the evening room. Tonight, at 7 sharp, we shall assemble once more. And then, Miss Amis, the truth shall be unveiled. He watched Edward depart, inhaled deeply, and arranged the personal items once more. Outside, the skies darkened, and the wind whispered through the treetops. Within the walls of Gorse Hill, the final act was poised to begin. Chapter 8, Revelation in the Drawing Room. That evening, as a low autumn sun burned crimson beyond the mullioned windows, Hercule Poirot summoned the residents and guests of Gorse Hill House to the drawing room. The lamps were lit, casting a warm glow over the polished oak paneling and the empty glass dome resting upon its velvet cushion. A hush fell as the company entered: Lord and Lady Bonwell, Edward Trevelyan, Clara Pelham, Samuel Worthington, Miles Hardwick, and, of course, Eloise Marchmont, whose bright gown seemed at odds with the room's somberness. Poirot stood before the fireplace, his little grey cells visibly at work. He bowed slightly in welcome, then began in his calm, measured tones. Miss Amis, this evening we conclude our weekend of mystery at Gorse Hill. You have all been most cooperative, perhaps more so than you realized. Tonight, I shall explain how the sapphire brooch vanished, how Madame Pelham was poisoned, and why each clue led inexorably to the culprit. He picked up the half-crushed matchbox. First, the theatre matches found beneath the rose trellis. They bear the unmistakable insignia of the Grand Lyric, London. Miss Marchmont, you brought that matchbox here when you arrived, did you not? Eloise's face paled, but she remained silent. Poirot continued, you used them to light a small gas lantern when you explored the rose garden at midnight, testing the secret passage's entrance. That is how you discovered the hidden corridor linking your boudoir to the drawing room. He laid the matchbox down and retrieved the script of the midnight heist. Second, your manuscript. You wrote a play mirroring these very events, the theft of a family jewel, a secret tunnel, dramatic poisoning. But this was no mere coincidence. You planned your premiere here, at Gorse Hill, using your play as both study and disguise. A murmur swept the room. Lady Bonwell clutched her husband's arm. Edward leaned forward, eyes searching Eloise's face. Next, Poirot said, the scrap of velvet found at the scene of the dome. That fragment matched the lining of your favorite cloak, worn on your first evening here. You brushed against the dome's edge in haste, leaving that telltale fiber. He held up the scrap. Eloise dropped her gaze. As for the plating of paint on Mr. Worthington's cufflink, Poirot went on, indicating Clara Pelham, it was not the banker's doing, but your own dramatist's trick. You borrowed a swatch of Clara's midnight blue paint from her portable palette and smudged it onto his cuff, to distract suspicion from yourself. Clara's eyes widened in indignation. I gave no permission. Poirot raised a gloved hand. Indeed, madam. But the smear occurred precisely during the interval when you left the drawing room to consult with the valet. Miss Marchmont sneaked that paint swatch from your bag, knowing it would pinpoint Mr. Worthington as culprit. He paused, letting the accusation sink in, then gestured to Miles Hardwick. The embroidered glove, initialed M, discovered in the secret passage. You, Monsieur Hardwick, lent your glove to Miss Marchmont, ostensibly to assist her research in the archives. She returned it by planting it in the corridor, framing you as the nighttime intruder. Your chartreuse shirt also brushed the latch, transferring pigment to the metal. Miles's shoulders slumped. He gave a small bow. I was flattered to aid her. I suspected nothing. Poirot nodded gravely. Finally, the poisoning. The tea caddy's second lid was unscrewed in the kitchen by a hand both deft and bold. You acquired aconite and belladonna from the house's Victorian medicine chest in the cellar, knowing the banker, Mr. Worthington, would dispose of empty vials without question. You introduced the poison into the blend at dinner preparation, confident the victim would be Madame Pelham, whose public collapse would serve as dramatic climax. He turned to Clara, who looked both relieved and affronted. Your role was unwitting, you were the decoy. You had admired the brooch legitimately and drank from your cup when I intervened. But you never intended harm. Clara rose and curtsied to him. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot shifted his gaze to Samuel Worthington. You, sir, were the second red herring, the man of finances threatened by scandal. Yet you never touched the caddy or the dome. Your anxiety sprang from the fear of being wrongly accused. Worthington exhaled, a slow relief flooding his features. I am grateful, monsieur. Poirot's final gaze fell upon Edward. And you, Edward Trevelyan, earnest and sincere. You alerted Scotland Yard to the poison, saving Madame Pelham's life. You are the only one who acted unselfishly throughout. Edward inclined his head, modest gratitude in his eyes. With all pieces thus placed, Poirot clasped his hands. Miss Amis, the crime was committed by Miss Marchmont, seeking the ultimate publicity stunt. A real-life drama to inspire her art, caring little for the moral cost. Yet true artistry, I believe, requires empathy, not only spectacle. Silence reigned. Eloise rose slowly, pale but composed. Monsieur Poirot, you have unmasked me thoroughly. I admit my folly. I sought the thrill, the acclaim. I never thought any harm would truly come to Madame Pelham. But now I see how dangerously close it came. Lady Bonwell, voice quavering, spoke next. Miss Marchmont, you betrayed our trust." And in that subdued gathering, the company absorbed the weight of her actions. Poirot recovered the brooch stone from its stand and held it aloft. "The sapphire may now return to its rightful place," he intoned. He lifted the dome and replaced it gently over the velvet cushion, unblemished, as though no mischief had occurred. But let today's events remind us all that elegance of manner should be matched by integrity of character. He set the dome down and bowed to the company. "And now, Miss Amis, I shall take my leave. Gorse Hill's little grey cells have done their duty once more. May your future gatherings involve only conversation and tea, never again theatrics of peril." Lord Barnwell stepped forward. "Monsieur Poirot, your brilliance has saved us from scandal and sorrow. We are in your debt." Poirot smiled modestly. "It is my pleasure always to serve justice, and, I trust, to entertain." With that, he collected his cane and hat, offering each guest a courteous nod before departing into the late evening gloom. As the drawing-room door closed behind him, the house exhaled. Outside, the wind rustled the boughs of ancient oaks. Within, the sapphire glimmered once more, a silent testament to the detective who, with methodical grace and unerring acumen, had woven together every delicate thread, and revealed the true architect of the weekend's drama. And so ended the mystery of Gorse Hill, a tale of ambition, intrigue, and the triumph of the little grey cells.